Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the launch of AIDA's Asylum Information Database Annual Report 2013-2014. I'm Michael Beaver and I'm the Secretary General of AIDA. In a few minutes, I'll hand over to my colleagues to present the findings of the report. And thereafter, we'll have representatives of 3 ECRA member organizations talking about the realities of seeking asylum in the EU in their respective countries: Italy, Cyprus, and Bulgaria. Then we'll open for questions from the floor, and we'll be pleased to speak with you after the session ends as well. Much of the formal reporting on asylum in the EU revolves around figures and statistics. While this is necessary and useful, we should never lose sight of the fact that we are not counting commodities, but rather each number represents a person fleeing for their life, across borders to an unknown future, all the while seeking security and a return to normality. Let's pause to reflect on the human drama behind every refugee story. The separation of families, the loss of children, spouses, or friends, the abandonment or destruction of homes and lifestyles, the loss of livelihoods, and the shattering of dreams, the physical and psychological abuse, torture, rape, and death experienced along the way. While displacement is a bland word, the path of the asylum seeker is difficult, full of danger, and traumatic. Through the support of EPIC, the European Program on Integration and Migration, and the Odyssean Foundation, ECRA and its partners, Forum Refugee COSI, the Irish Refugee Council, and the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, have been able to analyze national asylum systems from a user perspective, utilizing the information and experience gained by NGOs and experts working every day with those seeking international protection. Our members work with people rather than numbers. One of the greatest challenges to Europe and the common European asylum system over the past year has related to the arrival of asylum seekers on the southern shores of the European Union. For while the right to seek asylum is formally recognized as a fundamental right under Article 18 of the European Charter on Fundamental Rights, and more people are fleeing increasingly challenging crises, Most of the EU's money and efforts with respect to asylum in Europe seem to be directed towards creating more obstacles to reach EU territory, with the notable and praiseworthy exception of the Italian Navy's humanitarian effort Mare Nostrum, and the possibilities of a yet undefined Frontex-coordinated joint operation, Triton. The lack of legal avenues of entry to the EU results in millions of euros being channeled into the pockets of organized crime, unscrupulous smugglers, and human traffickers. EU investment in sophisticated border surveillance, the externalization of border controls through cooperation with the main countries of transit, and member state investments in expensive fence-building projects exacerbates the situation and leaves the impression that Europe's focus is on preventing entry rather than protecting people. It is disturbingly ironic that the recognition rates in the EU of most of the asylum seekers on unseaworthy vessels, such as Syrians and Eritreans, are very high. In fact, the blended rate of recognition for Syrians across the EU is well over 90%. Why are children and adults forced to put their lives at risk when it is almost certain they will receive recognition once they cross the EU borders? Furthermore, some cross or approach the EU border only temporarily. Credible and persistent allegations of pushbacks at the EU's external borders continue, such as at the Greek-Turkish border, the Bulgarian-Turkish border, and the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. While the denial of access to the territory at the EU's external borders is simply unacceptable, these actions also undermine the credibility of the common European asylum system as a whole and are a damning indictment of the EU institutions and agencies. With mandates to act in compliance with and protect fundamental rights, the relevant EU agencies must step up efforts to establish and ensure proper human rights monitoring at the main entry points of the EU. Finally, the recent arrivals in Italy reveal the delicate nature of solidarity in the field of asylum. For while each individual member state has the responsibility to build and maintain its asylum system at an appropriate level, and with the ability to properly respond to contingency conditions, the common European asylum system requires a shared vision of how situations such as the current conditions in Italy can be addressed in a collaborative European manner, as there are ramifications for other EU member states as well. You will hear details from my colleagues on how our report demonstrates that while there is visible progress on a number of aspects related to the implementation of the common European asylum system, many gaps in the asylum systems of member states and the functioning of the EU's common policy on asylum remain to be addressed. The biggest gap remains between the theory of a common European asylum system, where similar cases are treated alike and result in the same outcome, and the reality, where the common European asylum system proposes myriad obstacles for refugees seeking protection in Europe. It is critical to continue work on the implementation of the common European asylum system. However, such a system should logically presuppose safe and legal access to the EU. The current situation in Italy highlights the need for urgent debate and action at EU level to create safe and legal access for the children, women, and men in need of protection. We and our members continue to call for EU policies and European practices that place a priority on the protection of people over the policing of borders. So thank you. With that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Hélène to start with the presentation.
Thank you. Just want to see the people standing in back there for seats you can use at the report. Just before going into the findings of the report we're presenting today, I just wanted to tell you a bit more about the project, because this report is part of a project, the Asylum Information Database, as Michael mentioned, funded by EPIN and the Edison Foundation. We started this project 2 years ago, exactly, and we already published one annual report last year around the same time. The project is the project is a multifunctional database that is available online at Asylum in Europe report, and so there is a number of components to this database. One, the main one being national country reports that are all on the same format, drafted by EPRE members experts, national level. Until very recently, we had 14 countries represented, and very couple of weeks ago, we published an extra report on Cyprus, and we have our Cyprus colleague from Cyprus here today. And we will also very shortly publish a report on Croatia. As a new member state, we thought it was quite important to add Croatia to the database. We will also soon, by the end of the year and early 2015, add a report on Turkey and a report on Switzerland. These reports are updated regularly. We already updated twice the national reports. The last update is from the spring of this year, and the results, the findings of the annual report we're presenting today, Mind the Gap, are based on those national reports. So, to start the presentation, I was just going to give you some numbers. Michael highlighted that behind each of those numbers there are people, men, women, and children. But just to give you a global idea of where we are in the EU, so those are the data for 2013. There were 435,285 applicants in the EU 28 last year, and this is an increase, a 30% increase from last year. An increase that has to be put in context of two things. One is, I will mention it later, the main applicants are Syrians, and there's been an increase in Syrian applicants last year due to the enduring and conflicts. And also, we have to keep in mind that developing countries still host 86% of the world's total refugee population, and this is only refugees. If we count the number of people displaced because of conflict, so if you think about Iraq, a lot of people are still displaced internally or in Ukraine, then we are at 51 million people displaced worldwide. So we always have to keep that in mind when we speak about numbers in Europe. And there's 5 member states that receive 70% of the total number of applicants. So those are the states, Germany being the first one. Then you have France, Sweden, the UK, and Italy. Again, the Germany and Sweden being in the top 5 is to be reflected on the fact that they are the main hosting states of Syrian asylum seekers. And also Italy was not in the list in 2012, which is partly a consequence of the number of arrivals in Italy at sea. As I mentioned, by far, the main country of origin of applicants is Syria. It's 12% of the total, so that shows that there's a really wide variety of nationalities applying. Then you have Russia, people coming from the Russian Federation, Afghanistan, Serbia, and Pakistan. So arrivals at sea, this has been in the headline of news recently, so you would probably know some of those numbers. Just to show that there were 60,000 sea arrivals in 2013, but actually just between January and it should say 24 of August, I don't have the numbers for the last week of August, that was 114,000, so it's almost already doubled from last year. And this is quite a worrying trend because that means that more and more migrants and refugees are taking shaky boats and risking their lives to try to reach Europe. It also has to be seen that the majority of people arriving at sea are Syrians and Eritreans, nationalities that are in most cases granted refugee protection later. So we're talking about a lot of people who are fleeing for their life and that are risking their life for safety. It also shows, one of the explanations could be also that the Syrian crisis is lasting, the war is continuing. Protection in neighboring countries is not always there. The durable solutions are not always there. Some people that could have stayed in Libya for a while might then continue trying onwards to try to find real safety and a future in Europe. So in 2013, the numbers were still less than the numbers from the time of the Arab Spring in 2011, but we've seen that in 2014 it really increased. This is also in the context of the Mare Nostrum operation. We'll hear about that a bit later from our colleague from Italy. which has, since October 2013, rescued more than 120,000 people. So this has avoided a lot of tragedies, and now we have to see, Chris will talk a bit later about the response from the EU to those awareness. It is also to be put in the context of the closure of land borders, more strict controls and fences both at the Greek-Turkish border and the Bulgarian-Turkish border, and our colleague from Bulgaria will talk a bit later about issues around access to Bulgaria as well. Recognition rates. This is first instance, not final decisions, just to keep in mind, but that might surprise some people. Actually, Bulgaria, Malta, Italy are on the highest country recognition rates at first instance. But the number of countries are still below the EU average of 34%. And then Greece is still really low despite improvements in the grid system and the grid decision system. The highest number of people granted protection is in Sweden, which is also partly because of the law of Syrians and they are granted protection in Syria. And then in Germany, France, Italy, and the UK. So actually the 5 main hosting countries are also the 5 countries that grant the most refugee protection. It's not, you cannot really draw general conclusion from these numbers because each country receives different types of applicants, each country has different systems. Some numbers are higher at appeal, but it's just to give you a short overview. So to come back to Syrians, which is the main nationality of Africans, but also the main nationality granted protection. I don't know if you can see the numbers on the maps really well, but recognition is probably quite high because they are, they are in need of protection, and countries do recognize that, even though you can see that in Italy it's still relatively low. However, in a number of countries, Syrians are still not granted refugee status, but a subsidiary protection status or temporary status, which grant them access to less rights in some countries, such as family reunification. There was a positive development in 2014. More and more countries did grant refugee status or more permanent status to Syrians. And there was an increase, for instance, in Austria, France, the UK, or Poland. And to recall that since September 2013, so since last year, Sweden has been granted all Syrians a permanent residence permit, which grant them more rights. And it's an important aspect for their integration into the Swedish society and rebuilding their lives there. Some states would say this is why Sweden gets the most application and it's a pull factor, but I just remind you that Germany is the second country of destination for Syrians, whereas in Germany, Syrians are mostly granted subsidiary protection, and so a temporary residence permit. So this is all quite positive news, but this is only if they can get there. As I said, for the global numbers, the Syrian numbers are also to be put in perspective. Europe is hosting about 3% of the total number of Syrians that have fled their country. There we have passed the 3 million mark of Syrian refugees, whereas since 2011 there have been about 105,000 new asylum applications in the EU. Again, a lot of those Syrians who are granted protection are coming by sea, risking their lives. Some of them lost their lives at sea. A number would like to take legal routes, but it's not possible. And Chris will talk a bit more about legal channels to access Europe. And here I also put a quote from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, who said in July that never was so little done by so many for so few. So here he was referring to resettlement efforts in Europe, and the response from Europe has been quite disappointing, I could say, even though some countries are showing some good faith and goodwill. Recently, Germany pledged to receive an additional 10,000 Syrian refugees, even though they're a receiving country. Could also mention Austria, which pledged to receive an additional 1,000 refugees on top of their earlier commitments. And we also have a program launched in Ireland on humanitarian admission. And the UK also launched a program for some several hundred refugees. But this is still, as I said, it's still really difficult to reach Europe safely. And now that I've given you some numbers and some background, Chris will talk to you more about the key EU developments and the EU response.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. As I explained, I mean, the main focus of the report is, of course, on the actual practice in the 15 countries that we are covering, but with respect to asylum procedures, reception conditions, and detention. And of course, that's why we have two representatives of key countries currently in the meeting. But we also try to use the annual report to look back a bit at what, at the EU level, what has happened, and what are the key trends that we see there. And the second chapter of the report, as you will see, if you plug your USB stick into your computer, you will see that we are covering a number of key developments, including, for instance, the adoption of the Asylum and Migration and Integration Fund, which is obviously a kind of a key development in terms of the restructuring of how the funding for asylum and migration is going to be used. But I'm not going to deal with that here today because we don't have the time. I will basically focus on two other aspects that we are dealing with in this part of the annual report. One is what you could say the EU response to what is the key trend, the key factual trend over the last year, which is indeed the increasing number of people arriving by sea, mainly in Italy. And secondly, I would like to briefly reflect on the strategic guidelines that have been adopted by the European Council recently as well in June, and what that tells us about the future perspectives and how European leaders think about the future steps in the development of the common policy. If we look at the EU's response to the growing number of people arriving at sea in the past year, it's clear that the tragic events in October 2013 were actually that sparked the whole debate at the EU level, and there was a lot of outcry. Political leaders solemnly swear we should do everything possible that this can never happen again at Europe's shores. But at the same time, that period of political outcry didn't last too long. And usually when those things happen, the European Union actually did what it does best. It sets up a task force. So the task force on the Mediterranean was the kind of immediate response of the EU institutions. And it basically listed a long list of 77 measures that would contribute to reducing or preventing the loss of life at sea. But when you look at those measures, it's basically indeed listing what, for the most part, it's actually listing what the European Union was already doing. And it's striking to see that in that approach of the task force, there is indeed a lot of emphasis on the cooperation with third countries, with the perspective of, in order to save lives, we actually need to prevent people from entering into these journeys, so we need to work together with third countries more in order to step up their capacity to control their borders and to prevent people from moving on irregularly. That's, of course, a legitimate concern, probably a legitimate objective, but the other side of the coin is, of course, that those type of measures also affect those who are in need of international protection and are in need of international protection in the EU, because it indeed affects their possibilities to enter the EU physically. And that aspect of the discussion, how do we
ensure access to the territory in a safe and legal manner. That was admittedly included actually in the communication of the Commission as one of the strands, but it's very clear, and it was very clear in the debates afterwards, that that was not the key priority for member states. There is reference to the more increased use of regional protection programs, so creating protection space outside of the EU, but there is not so much a debate about creating legal access or creating legal channels for refugees to access protection in the EU. It's mainly a topic that needs to be further explored by the Commission, the communication says, and there is actually also a reference to the possibilities of organizing joint processing of asylum applications outside of the EU. So we're dangerously close again to the Chile proposals back in 2003-2005, which was a whole debate also among the NGO community about how these kind of systems could actually de facto result in the externalization of protection applications of member states towards countries which with far less capacity to host refugees than in the EU. I think the discussion here on the joint processing is slightly different from what we've seen in 2003-2005. So it will be interesting to see where this discussion is going to go at the EU level, if it's going to go anywhere at all. But it is something that I think is quite important in the current debate about the common European asylum system and the ways that the EU is developing to address the situations that we are seeing today at the southern borders. There is a lot to say about that very idea of joint processing. There is a lot of legal, practical questions that need to be addressed, and there is a lot of skepticism about it. But I think the debate needs to be done. Together, of course, with the whole idea of creating additional legal channels for refugees to reach the EU in safety. As far as the actual search and rescue component of the response to the sea arrivals is concerned, again, it took the Commission and it took the European Union a long time to come up with a first concrete step. As we all know, the Mare Nostrum operation, which then referred to, which Christopher will discuss a bit more in detail, I think, later on. It was, for the vast majority, is run by the Italian authorities, and there was limited national initiative. Now, of course, we have heard the announcement of Commissioner Malmström and Minister Alfano on the organization of a so-called Frontex Plus, or Triton, as it is now being called. But there are a lot of there's a lot of unclarity about what it actually means, how much resources will be made available, and what the actual geographical scope of the operation will be. So a lot needs to be answered first before we can actually have an assessment of that initiative. But nevertheless, it needs to be acknowledged that there is now the first move, although it seems to be a quite limited one, the first move to stepping into that particular operational side of search and rescue. It's going to be interesting to see how many member states, which member states are going to be willing to participate in that. I think that will tell us a lot about what the actual intentions behind the operation would be. And the question, of course, the question about is this creating a pull factor or not, is certainly going to be part of the debate for the coming years. And it's a very difficult question. It's a very difficult question because indeed, this whole situation is raising kind of a dilemma for the EU as well as for NGO activists, I think, whether you indeed prioritize saving of lives, which we should do, but at the same time, is this not creating more possibilities for stepping things? Anyway, I think that's as far as the policy side of things are concerned. We have, of course, seen the adoption of two legislative instruments. The most recent one is the External Sea Borders Surveillance Regulation, which basically lays down a number of rules with regards to disembarkation, interception at sea, search and rescue in the context of Frontex operations, which has been adopted with a remarkable speed. I remember before that the proposal was presented in April 2015, I think. We talked to member states representatives at the time, and we asked about is there a chance that this will ever be adopted before the end of the parliamentary term of the previous parliament. Everybody said no way, this is not going to happen. There was too many opposition, mainly from the southern member states, too many obligations for them. And that quickly changed after the tragic events that I mentioned that happened in October. So that having said, I mean I think there are a number of positive aspects about that regulation. I think it strengthens the procedural and fundamental rights safeguards for people being intercepted or rescued at sea. At the same time, there is this dangerous component. The regulation does indeed allow to divert vessels outside of the territorial waters, for instance, and it is very unclear how exactly in practice this is going to be applied. Our initial assessment of this regulation is that you have to, of course, read this in combination with other safeguards laid down in the EU Asylum Acquis, also the Charter, and not last but not least, of course, the rules laid down by the European Court of Human Rights in the Hirsi judgment. And that, I think, leads to a conclusion that it would be highly unlikely for in the context of this operation, to be arguable that people could be disembarked in a third country before a proper assessment, individual assessment of their protection has been made. So I think it's rather a positive step there, but nevertheless, of course, we will have to see how it is being applied in practice. Operational plans of Frontex have already been adopted for ongoing operations in that context. And the problem with the organization of these operations is that operational context plans need to contain a number of very specific safeguards as to how, for instance, legal assistance, access to effective remedies, that is going to be organized in practice. Operational plans are not public, so this is going to be an issue of who controls that. Secondly, the Eurosur regulation, has been presented by the Commission from the beginning as the kind of life-saving tool. We're using modern technology. We're using all the satellites we have to protect migrants in distress at sea and at the land borders at an early stage. So that allows us to prevent for the loss of life. That is absolutely true. There is a huge life-saving potential in that system. Once it will work properly, there are still a number of issues there. But at the same time, of course, let's not forget that Eurosur also allows member states and Frontex and the agencies about what's happening before the summer border, before migrants and refugees reach the combine that with increasing emphasis on cooperation with third countries, and you could see that the Eurosur regulation could indeed become some kind of nomination. But nevertheless, I mean, I think as in general there are the tools have been strengthened now at the EU level, specifically with regards to the issue of rescue at sea, which is a positive development. But of course, we should not forget that this only applies to operations coordinated by Frontex. We know that possibilities for Frontex to do that are limited, the budgets are limited, and the majority of operations are actually carried out by member states themselves or at cases. So there could be a situation developing where we have some kind of double standards. Very quickly on the strategic guidelines, I think disappointment is the word that summarizes the whole thing. I think there was a lot of expectations about what EU leaders would say about the next steps now that the Stockholm program is coming to an end. What is going to be the vision for the EU to further develop the common policy on asylum, and nothing of the clear that it has nothing to do with the kind of multi-annual programs that we have had in the past. That wasn't the intention at all from the start. That's true. But nevertheless, I mean, what's in there, what's in the strategic guidelines, is so meager and so vague that it's really you know, really wonder why they were actually adopted and what they should stay for. It's very clear the guidelines are there to confirm the mantra of the EU institutions. We are in an implementing mode. We have adopted the standards. We need to comply to expose them, and let's not think about anything else for the next 5 years. That, you know, it's true that of course implementation is key. Proper implementation is key. Monitoring of that implementation by the Commission is key. That's correct. But I think there are a number of issues that will have to be addressed one way or another at EU level, and that will probably also imply further legislative steps. There are a number of issues related to freedom of persons, for instance, mutual recognition, the transfer of protection statuses of refugees and people with people with subsidiary protection, where further steps would be needed, and it would actually be logical steps if we are indeed working towards a system where, you know, a status granted is valid throughout the EU, which is currently I would conclude on that part on the EU developments. I think there is a need, as Michael has mentioned already. I think what both the discussion on the strategic guidelines and the whole discussion on and the current EU response and the hesitance of EU member states to really engage in the debate around what are we going to do with situations such as Italy when we are confronted with influx. I think these are key questions for the future of the common European asylum system. To what extent can we actually call it a common policy on asylum with the engagement of EU institutions and other member states in this particular issue? It's true that the whole discussion around solidarity is very complex and very delicate. We are the first to say that individual member states have an individual responsibility to deal with the influx that they are receiving, and they have to prepare themselves and provide sufficient resources and capacity. But at the same time, looking at it from the perspective of asylum seekers, there is always the issue, not only in the situation of Italy, but also Bulgaria, for instance, the major crisis as well last year. You know, to what extent are asylum seekers and refugees at the end becoming the victims of that doing political debate? The effects. Okay, I'm very quickly now going to turn to the third chapter of our presentation, a short presentation, looking at the actual practice. What we've, as explained by Helen, we are looking now at the situation of, in total now, 15 EU member states. Croatia to be added quickly, or rather soon, probably before the end of the month, but we were not able to incorporate the findings in regards to Croatia, unfortunately, for this report. What we've done is we've adopted more or less the same approach as last year. We've tried to look at specific trends, at remarkable developments there, and we have looked at 7 themes basically. 4 are the same as last year, and those include effective remedy, access to effective remedy, access to the territory and to the procedure, access to an effective remedy, legal assistance, material subject to detention. But we have added now 3 new topics, thematic issues that we have looked at, and those include subsequent asylum application, safe country concepts and the treatment of identification treatment of persons with specific needs. I will simply say 2 words about the issue of access to legal, to effective remedy and legal assistance, and the issue of the safe country concept. I will be very brief because I'm using my time. Simply to say that on the issue of access to legal assistance, we unfortunately see more or less the same problems that we have already highlighted last year. We do see increasing difficulties for asylum seekers to access free legal assistance, whereas at the same time there is this paradox that asylum procedures become or are actually quite complicated, specifically for people who are actually not familiar with the administrative and legal system in the countries where they arrive, who have the who have the problem of not speaking the language and so on. And yet we see that there is growing obstacles for asylum access to legal systems there. Especially at the first instance of the procedure, which is of course a critical point in the assessment of asylum. And there we do see that in a number of countries such as Hungary, Poland, Cyprus, for instance, access to free legal assistance at the first instance is mainly dependent on whether or not NGOs who get funding through EU funds like the ERF and now the AMIF to provide legal assistance. There are often at the national level interruptions in the funding, which means that they have to cut down or stop during a certain period their activities in terms of legal assistance at the appeal stage, of course, is mandatory under the procedure directive. In practice, there is access to legal assistance in most of the member states as well that we cover with the AIDA database, but still there are issues such as merits testing, meaning making access to legal assistance dependent on the likelihood of your appeal being successful is still an issue in a number of countries, including the United Kingdom and Germany. Budget cuts still very much an issue in the UK. Other systems, like in the Netherlands, do create disincentives actually for lawyers to engage in certain cases. For instance, in the Netherlands, there's this new system of no cure, less fee, which was introduced to because the free legal assistance for asylum seekers want to submit a subsequent asylum application. And so these type of mechanisms are now being used in the Netherlands to reduce that. The low remuneration for lawyers under legal aid schemes is actually still reported to be a problem in a variety of countries, Malta, Belgium, France, Sweden. Even in those systems with very well developed legal aid systems, is very much seen as a problem. And it prevents actually good lawyers to engage in such. Access to an effective remedy, there we have seen some positive developments actually, in particular with regards to the automatic suspensive effect of the appeal. There is a particular positive development in Belgium, where in particular with regards to appeals on negative decisions on subsequent asylum applications from safe countries of origin. There is a recent change in the law which now makes those appeals actually automatic suspensive, whereas that was not the case previously. And that is also it's partly also a result of developments in the case law of the European Court, where the court has actually, in recent cases concerning Belgium and also Cyprus has indeed indicated that there are risks in systems whereby the suspensive effect needs to be requested separately. Undermines. And then to finalize very quickly on safe country concepts. Among the 15 countries that we cover in the database, the safe country of origin and safe third country concepts are actually, in many of them, in the law. But what you see in practice is that it's mainly the safe country of origin concept that is the most relevant. and that is being applied in practice. But still there, the number of countries that actually do apply those safe country of origin concepts is not the 15 member states. Basically, 8 of them, and it is most widely used of those 8 in countries such as France and UK. The thing with the safe country of origin concept, of course, is that it in those countries has very important negative consequences for science in terms of access to procedural safeguards. And for instance, in France, it means that those people are not entitled to temporary residency permit on asylum grounds. The appeal is dealt with in a, or the claim is dealt with in a national procedure, which means an appeal without suspensive effect. And those people are also excluded from the regular reception accommodation system. Just one example of what the consequences of and then a final remark is on what is actually the use and utility of those concepts in the current context of the common asylum system. What we see is that the countries who do actually apply the country of origin concept do have national lists of the countries that they consider safe, and those lists are usually different. So the basic conclusion of that is that those member states don't have the same concept of what a safe country of origin is for the purpose of examining the asylum application. Now that is strange if you're working towards a common European asylum system where similar cases should be treated alike and result in the same outcome. If you don't agree on which countries you actually consider safe, I think that is creating a problem. And as the recast Asylum Procedures Directive no longer contains a legal basis to adopt a common list at EU level, I think it's very questionable whether this concept and whether these national lists can actually be maintained. But I leave it here.
So, as Chris mentioned, we added another chapter, but a section on unaccompanied children in the report. Just to highlight, I would say 2 or 3 with detention, but I'll talk about detention in a minute, of the key aspects relating to unaccompanied children's treatment in the EU. The first of it is age assessment, and it's a key issue for member states themselves. There's the European Asylum Support Office, EASO, has done a lot of work on that. They published a publication. So they published a publication recently, not giving instruction on what method should be used, but a number of safeguards and different methods used. Age assessment is not used systematically across Europe, but is still used in many cases. A lot of methods that we consider sort of invasive are still used, so that includes the most common would be X-ray of a part of the body, but also something that is called sexual maturity evaluation, which in blank terms just means evaluation of the development of the genitals and the breast for the women and the pubic hair. It's also another issue with age assessment is that, as it depends in the very beginning of the procedure, many of the young people in some countries are treated as adults during this procedure, even if they're determined to be children afterwards, which means they're not assisted by a guardian or they don't have the same rights as children, which brings me to my second point, the key role of guardians when it comes to unaccompanied children. The guardianship doesn't exist in all member states. For instance, in the UK, it doesn't exist as such. But we've seen that it's a person, a figure with a key role, is a stable figure for a child during the procedure. But there is a number of issues, including guardians are only really late, sometimes months later, sometimes not at all if the child is 17 when they arrive. There will not be clear who does what, many different people doing this role. And I just take this opportunity to remind you that we also published recently report on legal assistance to unaccompanied children, where this also was one of the key findings, the importance of the guardian, including access to legal assistance. So as I said, I'll talk about detention. Detention in general, detention is now allowed specifically, of course, under the Reception Conditions Directive, and there's still detention is still a reality in many states, even if it's not used frequently or in most cases in many of the states we talk about. It's particularly a reality at the borders of an irregular entry. So it's the case in Bulgaria when people cross the border irregularly, but also in Malta or Greece, that people are detained upon irregular entry before sometimes they can even ask claim asylum. But it's also very common in the Netherlands and Belgium at airports when people arrive without documentation. And only since May 2014 that in the Netherlands families with young children are not detained and transferred to reception centers before they were. It's also, detention is quite frequent pending transfer under the Dublin regulation in a number of countries, you have them on the slide, or after they've been transferred to the country that is responsible for their claim, then they're detained. I have to note there quite an important development in Germany. The German Federal High Court recently ruled that detention for the purpose of transferring a person under Dublin regulation was illegal because there was no definition of the risk of absconding in the national law. And the regulation insists on the importance of defining the risk of absconding. The risk of absconding is the ground that is the most often used to detain asylum seekers. So it's quite an important development. Detention is an important issue in Malta and Cyprus. It's quite often mentioned, so I won't go into detail. And when it comes to children, it's also still a reality. It's allowed in a number of countries, not used that much in practice in some countries, but only 4 countries we cover, Belgium, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Italy, actually have legal provision prohibiting detention, even though it still happens in Bulgaria and France. And then more worryingly, in recent years, and that's so unaccompanied children also are still detained in a number of countries. Sometimes because they are considered to be adults for a while, families as well. And when it comes to detention for everybody, it has very terrible consequences for adults, even more for children, psychological one, but also because some of them have been through a lot of hardship before and then they're put under detention. It also means limited access to a number of rights, so it's not to be ignored, and also to mention that detention conditions have been, the European Court of Human Rights has found that detention conditions in a number of countries amounted to inhuman and degrading treatment, and that's, among others, would be Greece, Malta, and Belgium, and that's been really very recent. I'm going to conclude with reception. We already mentioned reception last year, so this year we focused on other aspects of reception conditions. One of them being reception capacity and the issue of overcrowding. So even though most countries there is no overcrowding as such of reception center, another issue we wanted to highlight is that in a number of countries, the ones that are in red on the table, do not have enough places for the number of asylum seekers, which means that either they have to resort to private housing on their own funds, or if they do not have enough money to pay for their own housing, they have to sleep in the street. There's still some overcrowding in some countries, but it's not the main issue. So, issue of capacity is very well known for Greece. It has been also highlighted in Cyprus, but it's also a big issue in France. For instance, by the end of 2013, there were still 15,000 asylum seekers on a priority waiting list to obtain a space in a reception center. And the waiting period was about 1 year on average. So in the meantime, in France in particular, they're either accommodated in what they call emergency facilities, so it could be a gym facility for children that is converted into a shelter, or they have to sleep in the streets. A lot of people sleep in the parks in Paris. On the contrary, while Belgium had a reception crisis for a couple of years. It's not a problem anymore in Belgium, also linked to the fact that there's been quite a reduction in asylum application. In terms of conditions in reception centers and other facilities, it's a mixed picture. We're going to draw general conclusion. One of the main reasons is that reception is decentralized in most of the countries, so you will have a very different situation from one part of the country to another. But there's still very complicated and problematic conditions in Malta, Bulgaria, and Ireland. Even though in Bulgaria the situation has improved, it's still problematic. Reception standards are only their positive aspect is in Poland and Belgium. You actually have reception standards that are in guidelines or in law, so that marks what are the standards to be respected. And I also wanted to highlight that in Austria, there's been a working group that was set up to discuss reception conditions and improve them in their reception. So thank you for your attention. All this is from the reports that some of you who arrived early got on a USB stick. It's also online on asylumineurope.org. And now we're going to have our
So we're now going to have a presentation of our experts from Italy, Cyprus, and Bulgaria. Cyprus, of course, because it's the new country that we've added to the database. Bulgaria, because it has gone through a major crisis to the standards of the Bulgarian asylum system, and there have been issues with regards to access to territory as well, with the land court, and Italy, of course, because of the current situation. So if you
maybe you can do it in the order of yours.
I'm not going to touch, of course, Egypt in what is the situation in Bulgaria, so that's familiarize themselves from the national report for that. I rather put my presentation in the context of what actually the topic of this report actually this is a gap, and what really drove the analysis of the data collected is what is to shine a light on what is the real community asylum system agenda and what are the real objectives. Because we see this gap between intentions and standards highlighted and actually put into the legislation and policies as announced, and the practice when the practice is applied. Whenever something big happens, when a crisis happens, or whenever all this good intentions that are put into policies and legislation have to be implemented with regard to real people on the field. Bulgaria has never been a big reception country. It's always been a country and still is. It has never been a country of final destination, neither for migrants nor for asylum seekers. But with the crisis in Syria, with the civil war in Syria, that is still ongoing, and the numbers in Turkey, the immediate Syria, reaching over 1 million of Syrians, we've been long predicting actually, and before we know that they have to defend themselves. Because sooner or later, these people will start to move on. so-called secondary movement worker, and having, in fact, the figures in Turkey having like all over Turkish government had some efforts to accommodate these people. The moving on of people that will come after it, and that the Turkish system will really suffocate with big numbers. And having the fact that actually Bulgarian reception is really extremely low as capacity, even for the very small figures of sound speakers, because for many years in Bulgaria had less than 1,000 sound speakers. Yeah. And that actually became a reality, our warnings, and in August, starting from August to October, with November 2015, Bulgaria received this couple of months approximately 12,000 sounds in the streets. And all of them came from the land movement. And the immediate reaction, of course, we are not prepared. We checked the situation where people were accommodated in the backyard of the wall with sexual alcohol under the open sky, with provided with nothing, food. Then we had a couple of hundreds people, including pregnant women and more, being accommodated under the open sky. Luckily, it was the summer period of time, so it's not that it's cold. But it turned out that the Bulgarian nationals absolutely not prepared to meet this kind of figures. And of course, they started to see the support for Europe and and it was really very demonstrative, actually, very telling what was the response of both. Because reception capacity was so little, and the government started to use detention centers for it. And had to be somewhere. They turned the governments, the European Commission, the UNHCR as well, for support for very vital things like food and education and all kinds of other stuff that had to be provided in addition. And it was really very telling what was the response from the Union and member states and actually the ASO. The immediate response to them was to send Frontex. And Frontex teams were there, let's say, a couple of days after all those people started reporting it. So the Frontex team was there to support with the logistics and interpretation so that people can be met and interpretation can be provided to the Bulgarian border officials in order to make this analysis and identification of persons coming in. And it was not sooner than the early spring, let's say end of February, beginning of March, when the EASO was ready with their assessment of the situation, and what EASO provided was favorable. And that really is really very telling about what actually is a preparedness of our system to react to whenever an emergency occurs in some part of it. Because whatever they can provide restraint and not immediate assistance in such a dire situation. So our advice to skilled workers, the European Union, would be in that respect that it might be that the responsibility lies with the United States to develop their national sound systems. But one of the aims of the Commonwealth in the sound system is to actually equalize the levels of the reception and actually equalize the standards of this as much as possible. It is But in order to do that, it's not just a matter of policy. It's not just a matter of slow development and give the time of the national authorities to reach the destinations and respond to this. Sometimes it's a matter of really assisting real people in need, and that's why the new REMIT and the new policy of the government should include this kind of measures, a kind of more speedy response to this kind of situations, if and when they occur. Because if we're talking about solidarity, that solidarity should not be only in adjusting our legislation to a certain standard, by the countries following that have already been there. And actually, it was situation to a certain extent in Bulgaria, because although as poor as it is, and poor reception conditions like that, but in terms of standards, access to territory and access to procedure, Bulgaria was a bit better than nowadays when we were into the European Union, because all this directives actually gave the boost the permission of the government to introduce new legislation where detention was introduced to South people, the tribe detention was introduced with regard to unaccompanied children, having the fact that presently national legislation has no provision to detain normal practice. And the thing that we can draw from our perspective as field workers is that sometimes the whole European sound system announced and meant to be bettering or actually improving the standards, and member states are not so developed in terms of having sound systems for a long period of time, actually brought to some of the countries lowering the standards. And you can see it from the response that was actually made with regard to the Bulgarian so-called devices, because immediately what was provided was strong that within some of the laws. Control, identification of persons, measures, all of things. That was done in a minute. When it comes to accommodation, reception, registration, support, all what was provided was training, and the European funding mechanisms, as all know, were really very, they're not adjusted to response to emergency situations. They're really slow, and they need time, and missions are compounding, which just doesn't work properly when it comes to. And another thing that happened after this so-called crisis, it was a crisis, also Bulgaria, really very small in the background of what happened in particular in Germany, Malta. But for a small country, Bulgaria, it was really a crisis, because 12,000 some seekers in a couple of months was a big number. But then what happened is that the Bulgarian authority decided to build a fence. Actually, this fence was built, and it exists there. And it was built to stop, literally, physically, the entering of the asylum seekers into the national territory, because the majority of people that came during this period of time, so, as I said, that was serious, which means that there were genuine refugees. Party refugees, because they're fleeing from war and they're fleeing to save their lives. Yet, the plans to build the border were hugely announced as to prevent the irregular migration. It was corroborated with reasons to strengthen national security and to prevent counter-terrorism. And all this was absolutely unanimously supported in the parliament, and with a huge amount of money in comparison what was actually voted by government for the improvement of the reception conditions, huge portion of money was dedicated and immediately voted to start building this fence, and this fence is already a factor. Along with the deployment of approximately 1,500 policemen along the borderline between Bulgaria and Turkey, and you could see the immediate result from this, from having a couple of hundreds to 1,000 people coming per week for the period between end August to mid-November. In December, the total number of people who entered the country and applied for asylum was less than 100. So you can see the immediate result of all these measures implemented, and with big resources dedicated to this. And it was with some support, or at least not the disapproval of the European Union. It was all announced as measures to prevent irregular migration and to secure the borders, the external border of Europe. And actually, we discussed all this at political, national level, and the level of the experts working in the asylum agencies, and police, more the police responsible for the implementation of these measures. The response was that, as members of the European Union, our prime concern, objective, and task is to protect the external border. Everything else comes second. And this is really very, indicative to what actually is the approach in Poland. Because at the time when the Bulgarian government was announcing the plans and all the measures that actually prevented people from entering the country, along with 5 million reports for pushbacks, including physical abuse, in one case people being imprisoned by the list of them was reported at the time, which means that pushback practices allegedly happened a large. Otherwise, you just can't, from the analysis, bring this big discrepancy of numbers. For example, usually what's going on when a big number of people starts to come in and then intensify the border measures, the usual explanation as well. With the weather changes and the change of the weather in climate, because the winter is particularly harsh in Bulgaria, that's why people drop in. But the weather, the climate was just the same in December as it was in November, and you see the drastic drop in numbers. So that could be explained only as a pushback. Practice applies that much, and it is still the case because we had, for the first period of the year, we had less than 3,000 people who officially applied for asylum in Bulgaria, of whom only, I will give the figure, only 987 asylum seekers were able to apply that period. And another 1,000 applied for a detention center, and that is because they were not able to immediately get their asylum applications when they were either handed to their settlement. I'll stop here, so if you have any questions.
Well, I will speak on Italy, but on Italy in the frame of the European and particularly EU policies in this moment, those that are on the debate and those that have already been. I think when we start to speak about Italy in terms of refuge, asylum, arrivals of people in need of protection, two features are underlined. The first one is the numbers. In Italy, there were never numbers of arrivals like in these last 8 months. Even not in '56, where the Hungarian crisis and the Soviet invasion were. Even not in '68, the Czech crisis. Even not during the Bosnian War or Kosovo in '98, '99. So never these numbers came to the point of having more than 100,000 people in 8 months arriving at the particular southern Italian coast. The figure given here in the report of estimated 106,000 is already overruled for the arrivals last days. Only the weekend go around 1st of September, on Friday or Monday, 1st September, 3,900 people have arrived, bringing with other arrivals these last days a total of around 115,000 now. Now we speak about the period from 1st of January. The other feature without any precedent, I think, in the whole of Europe, is the famous so-called Mare Nostrum operation. I think it never happened that the military institution, the Navy, is embarking due to a political decision of the national government to make a big operation of rescuing people and employing forces for the purpose. So it has to be highlighted. There was also mention of the Hilsi case. I know the Hilsi case came out of the country to Mare Nostrum pushback policy, pushing back people to Libya. Not just once or twice, but eventually declared the action policy actually implemented in 2009. So here we do not speak only, and this I should like to underline because in the public debate sometimes it is forgotten. It is not just a question of search and rescue when we speak about Mare Nostrum. Search and rescue is an obligation for everybody. It is the fact that search and rescue is carried out by military units, and that in all cases, as we know, people are then disembarked in Italian ports. Not in there's any question to bring people to Tunisia or to Egypt or unless so first to Libya. So it is part of the policy of Mare Nostrum that even those, and the vast majority, are rescued in international waters, where from the outset there is not a clear legal obligation to disembark these people in an Italian port. But it is very clear in this policy that only Italian ports can be used for disembarkation. What is the reason for this harsh increase of numbers of arrivals by sea? Three reasons come from that. The first one is, of course, the Syrian war. The Syrian war and the fact that, as always it happens, after a certain period of time, a certain number of refugees try to move away from the first country of asylum. These are the neighboring countries, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq. So they move partly by surface towards Bulgaria. They move in bigger numbers through Egypt, North Africa, to Libya. With the hope, of course, to reach conditions of life different from those that in the first countries of slavery can be offered. There are many people who have still some money, bring some money. Many of them are families, entire families. This is for Italy totally new, because normally the sub-Saharan African asylum seekers are young men. Now for the first time we have an impressive number of children, young children, babies, arriving on these boats. So people move on, of course, from the more than now 3 million Syrian refugees. It's a very, very minor proportion of people trying to move away from the first countries of arrival in the neighborhood of Syria. And many others are still stuck in Libya and in Egypt. This is also clear. And therefore, this will go on. So when we speak today about around 115,000 sea arrivals from the beginning of this year, it will come probably by end of this year to a figure around 150, 160,000. This, I repeat, is without any precedent and puts, of course, a number of challenges also for the Islamic opinion, to be very clear. The second reason for the increase in numbers is the situation of the Eritreans. Not so much that in Eritrea the situation has dramatically changed. The situation, and it is dramatic for many years, in particular for all the young people of both sectors. But the Eritreans who arrive, or many of them, do not arrive directly from Eritrea. They arrive from the huge reception centers in countries like Kenya, Sudan, and they have now less prospects, any hope of being resettled to the States or other third countries, because of the various crises and because of other priorities given in the various bigger resettlement programs, particularly in North Africa, Australia, but also Europe. So, having no hope at all, one day to be resettled from these warehouse camps. So they moved to Sudan, through the desert, 3,000 kilometers into Libya, and start them in the Libyan military, making all effort to cross over the sea. And there we come to the third reason, and this is the internal Libyan situation, totally chaotic Libyan situation, where not only there is no real central government, but where the militias are those, in part at least, in particular in the Tripoli area, and from Tripoli towards the Tunisian border, Soman, where the militia are directly involved in smuggling the people and earning a lot of money. So these three factors come together, and as you see from the statistics, the main nationalities are actually Syrians and Eritreans, and then you have a broad number of other nationalities, in particular from other African countries, but also from Nigeria and West African, other West African countries. Okay, this is broadly speaking the picture I should like now to present. Situation not in detail, so it would not be possible here now, but in three blocks, so three challenges, three questions. The first one is, as Chris already mentioned in some detail, also access. When we speak about access, we normally speak about access to protection. But we have to distinguish, and we have to be very clear that access means, first of all, access to a territory prior to access to protection, because access to protection has a precondition to have access to the territory, and I come back to it. The second block is Dublin system, freedom of establishment, intra-European solidarity, responsibility sharing, and this is under the debate, as you know. Why so many people arrive in that move forward to our European countries. And the second block is the question of reception, of insufficient reception places, conditions, but more so the lack of prospects for those who have got the protection status. Where do they live? Where do they work? Can they rebuild the life? These three blocks are interlinked, intimately between them. And if you start from what has been achieved in June 2013, the final adoption of the Common European Asylum System, 14 months ago, you see that this wonderful CEAS does not provide any answer to any of these three blocks challenges. We have no answer about the question to access. You have no answer about the question of intra-European solidarity, except from the repetition in Dublin Treaty, what has from the Dublin Convention of 1990, which is the approach. You have no implementation of what the Lisbon Treaty says about intra-European solidarity. And you have no real obligation of member states to foresee not only the reception of asylum seekers, but integration of the people. So when the strategic guidelines for the next year speak about the implementation of the CEF, that's very fine and very necessary. We're still in the process now of the implementation of national legislation of the Paris Directive. But it does not tackle what is in a number of countries, and I speak about Italy, what is at stake. We have no answer. We have no political answer. And therefore, you have all these meetings, Malmström, ministers of the interior, council of ministers, and so here and there. The next one will be in Luxembourg on the 9th of next October, where some decisions will be taken eventually. But there's no political stand, and there's no legal ground. Resettlement is not an obligation. The issuance of humanitarian visas is no obligation. The establishment of humanitarian corridors is no obligation. It is totally left to the discretion of the national governments. And they are under influence, of course, and this is, as Chris mentioned rightly, public opinion has been influenced and shocked by what happened in October last year around Lampedusa and around Malta. Well, we always speak about 366 died on 3 October, very close to Lampedusa, and less some days later, 66 died, and Malta killed. So maybe more than 440 people in 4 days. So this was a shock, and the public opinion had it. So yeah. Some remarks on these three roads. People arrive in Italy not because they like to come to Italy, but because it is the nearest country. This is very clear. And it's sufficient to make a map now to see when you are in Libya, where would you go? And I think this very simple question is not understood in the other European countries. It is simply a geographical question. As a matter of fact, it is more surprising that around 40% of those who arrive in these months remain in the society. Around 40%, between 35%. We speak today, during the same period that we had 115,000 sea arrivals, estimated figure of around 40,000 asylums. Maybe it's higher the figure. Unfortunately, you do not have in Italy a really statistical system like the Federal Office in Nuremberg in Germany, providing monthly asylum statistics. So, roughly speaking, 40% remain, 60% move on. 60%. This is not surprising that 60% move on, but it is surprising that not 80% move on. This is the real point. If it is true that Italy is nothing else for most of them than the first port of arrival in the European territory. So, therefore, the question of access to the territory is distinct from the question of access to protection. It is not a question of access to protection in Italy, it is a question of access to protection in Europe. And Europe, I do not speak only about the European Union, but also about four southern countries, like Switzerland. Europe. Access to protection in Europe is at stake for people who have or not access to the territory of one member state. And this is not understood in the that these are two questions that are interlinked, but have to be treated separately. As long as it is true, of course, that access to a territory is a precondition for access to protection. If someday you would have the possibility to come to Europe in a legal manner and a protected manner, whether on basis of the settlement schemes, which are really generous and realistic, whether on the basis of the possibility to present a protection request at a diplomatic mission of the member state or of the European Commission as such, in a third country, whether country of origin or whether the transit country, in the moment come back to this. All this what we speak about, the safe and protected arrival of people in need or who may be in need of international protection. As long as this does not exist on a meaningful scale, access to protection presupposes access to protection. And then Mare Nostrum comes in. Mare Nostrum comes in. Let me just say one word about how it doesn't work. It was instituted 17th of October last year. It was a political decision. When you speak about the responsible officers of the Navy, and we will have them here in Brussels in this building at October in the conference on title, and we will have the chief commander of the Italian Navy here to speak about it, and you will see also from the plan that they are proud. You could say even they have found their raison d'etre as a Navy. What do they do with the Navy today? Some anti-piracy and so on and so on. For the rest, what do they do? Now they have a mission. They have a mission. And they are proud of it. And they have defended this mission. Even more, far more than the Minister of Interior, they have 6 naval units, 5 in 5 sectors in the Canal of Sicily. They have a huge monitor close to Rome, where is the command and center of it. They can, through this center, monitor all the movements in the Canal of Sicily, and then the system of sending people, sending the ship there where there is the possibility that people are in danger. 900 military personnel involved in this operation. Sometimes 8 boats are involved, like last weekend. Okay. You have at the same time, unfortunately, so around 1,900 deaths in the Mediterranean. But most of those who do not make it to Europe disappeared in Libyan territorial waters. And the Mare Nostrum cannot enter Libyan territorial waters or Tunisian waters. It is an operation in international waters, and this is important with respect to Frontex Plus. And so, the principal feature is that the Navy is operating only in international waters. The national waters, territorial waters, is a question of the Coast Guard. So now what is planned to implement as from end of October, end of November, on the Frontex or Frontex Plus, is to operate in territorial waters. Then this make no difference at all to what happened previously, because the risk is international waters. And the new thing, the whole Mare Nostrum operation, is that they operate in international waters, not in. Just one word about movement onwards from Italy, Dublin. We know Dublin has been approved, and that is not, to my mind, not realistic now to think that we can renegotiate Dublin over the next. But there are other means to come maybe to a solution, and one is actually this mutual recognition of positive societal decisions. With all the consequences. So that means that once you are recognized in Italy for such a very protection, and then you go to Sweden or to Germany, you will benefit in Sweden and Germany from the qualification directive. You will have all the rights in the qualification directive. This would empty out Dublin. It would bypass. The other possibility would be to extend the directive on long-term migrants. Yeah, you know, 5 years also people that are for international protection can benefit from the migrant directive. So move and establish themselves in another EU country with certain conditions. This period could be short, let's see, 1 or 2 years in favor of people who are recognized and for international protection. Because we know from hundreds and hundreds of interviews with people, it is not so much a matter where their asylum request is processed and determined. It is a question where they live afterwards. Just one word about recognition rate was mentioned before. The Syrians said in Italy quite a low recognition rate. This refers to the first half of last year. Today, the total population of Syrians who make an asylum request have any kind of protection in England. And the total number will come not probably more than 80% for all the nationalities of it. Chris warns me that I have to shut down. So many things to say. Very happy to answer also your questions. Last remark, where there is a very harsh efficiency in the Italian system, is that those who are recognized as national protection have no really prospect of having access to the labor market, access to housing, and we know from people who are stuck now around Calais and would like to go over to Dover and to the UK. Most of them have transited to Italy, but transited not during the last months. They have Italian residence permits. They are refugees recognized in Italy. And then afterwards, after 2 or 3 years, they become aware that they have no possibility to work and to rebuild a new life in Italy, and they move forward to France in order to get to UK. Dublin is not only a question in Greece, or in Malta, or in Italy. Dublin is also a question, for example, in Calais, in France.
As well as here, a quick thank you to the team of Backflip. It's wonderful project. I'm quite glad I'm following Mariana and Christopher because I'm going to share the situation in Cyprus, which builds on what Christopher said, but actually shows it from another angle. So there's many things that we could talk about in Cyprus, many problematic issues, lack of effective remedy, lack of suspensive effect. There's just a little bit of information about us. We've been offering free legal and social support to both asylum seekers and persons under international protection since 2006. So we work on the ground and have quite a lot of experience on what's going on in Cyprus. But today we'll be speaking about access to the territory. And if you know where Cyprus is, geographically, as Christopher said, you would expect quite a huge influx. We're very close to Syria, we're very close to Iraq, we're very close to Turkey. And contrary to Bulgaria, the authorities had warned of the huge influx of Syrians, and we call it the big influx that never happened. So just to give you a bit of, I'll give you a few numbers later on, but in 2013 we had approximately 400 applications from Syrians. And I'm going to speak a little bit about how people get to Cyprus, because when preparing the report from ECHA and the response on that section, it was quite clear that it gets a little bit confusing because of the political situation. But we will be seeing through the discussion that it's very linked to what Christopher said, that access to territory is linked to access to protection, and it's linked to access to a decent standard of living after, and reception conditions and durable solutions. And although I don't have the answer to the low numbers, I'm pretty sure it's quite linked there. So yeah, we don't have the influx. But let's just see quickly how people come to Cyprus, how asylum seekers come to Cyprus. So about 90% come in an irregular manner, and they come through the northern areas. And in case you're not familiar with the political situation in Cyprus, just so it gets a bit easier if you can actually see a map. After the events in 1974, the island is divided, and the south is the internationally recognized state, the Republic of Cyprus, and the north is not a recognized state, so we have this very interethnic situation. With accession in 2004, the EU law operates, is enforced in the south, but it's frozen in the north. So there's no asylum system in the north. So in the north, you cannot apply for asylum. You have to come to the Republic of Cyprus in the south, in the southern parts, to apply. Up to 2003, people could not cross. No, none of us could cross between the two areas. And then in 2003, we had the Green Line regulation that was set up to, in order to regularize movement between the two areas. So people come into in order to cross, there are now crossing points, but this is not a border, and it can never be perceived as a border. There are about 3 or 4 crossing points, and in order to cross these points, you have to have a legal right to stay in either the northern part or the southern part. And to pass these crossing points, you pass through police acting in the north and then police acting of the Republic of Cyprus in the southern part. So it's very, very difficult to cross if obviously you've entered the northern part in an irregular manner, as most asylum seekers will have done. So let's just see quickly. Access to the south. So with the accession to the EU, the sea control was strengthened, and we don't have boat arrivals, which again raises quite a few questions. Why would, for instance, Syrians prefer to go through Greece, through Evros, through much more turbulent seas, than try to access the south? I think it'd be they don't have to or they don't want to. Obviously, being an island, it's quite difficult to get either to the ports and the airports due to visa controls, but there are limited smuggling routes to the south because you can use the north, which is much easier. So persons arrive through the north either by air from sea, they come from Turkey, they arrive in the port in Kyrenia, and most, as I said, do so in an irregular manner. Since the Iraqi conflict, many of our clients had said, had given us the prices that to arrive to Cyprus, it was approximately 1,500 euros, whereas to reach northern countries, it was 10,000. And asking Syrian clients, now they give us approximately about the same numbers. So again, this is an accessible and cheap route. And brings the question, why are not more people trying to do so? So just to give you an indication of the numbers we're talking about, as I said, there has been a rise, but it's definitely not the numbers that we're seeing in the other Mediterranean countries, and quite alarming as we're probably closer than any of the other countries mentioned before. That brings us a little bit to the situations that Christopher was talking about. So what is it like coming to Cyprus? And maybe this is a deterrent of why people are not coming. So the reception conditions have never been idyllic. Although the authorities will claim that we are a haven for asylum seekers, we as workers on the ground have never actually seen this happen. So even prior to the financial crisis, on paper, the reception conditions always looked much better than they actually did in practice. They were always difficult to access, and they were always insufficient. And then we had the financial crisis, which was approximately 2012 and onwards. And that brought the deterioration of an already problematic system, and also the perfect excuse, as we've seen in many EU countries. So, especially for asylum seekers, the financial crisis had detrimental effects, as usual, being the vulnerable group. They were hit first. So we briefly had 3 reception centres, and 2 were closed down in April 2013, leaving many persons homeless, having to revert to private accommodation. The financial crisis also brought on some legislative changes. It was used as a scapegoat in the media by many politicians, and this led to changes in legislation, changes in practice, and just to give you an indication right now, persons who cannot have accommodation at the reception center receive very small amounts per month. However, even this amount is not received by everyone. So to give you an indication of the 800 new applications of all countries of origin submitted in the first half of 2014, only 200 new applications were submitted for support. So in a country where there's no jobs, either to work regularly or irregularly, the question poses, why are these people not even trying to access the resources that are supposedly available? Asylum seekers are not allowed to work in the first 6 months, yet welfare support is not automatic. And even after that, the sectors they're permitted to work to are very of the lowest paid and unskilled, and very, very low availability. The new changes in the legislation also brought limitations to access to free healthcare systems. So this actually, before the financial crisis, was an area that we were quite happy with, and unfortunately that also has taken a downturn. And we've seen a general rise in discriminatory practices and attitudes. Currently we have some new involvement, where the one Romanian reception center is now being enlarged from with EU funding, and it's going from 75 persons to 450, which I suppose on paper looks quite good. But this center is in a very remote area, it's a little lower, and there's absolutely no prospect of integration. There's no access to the cities unless you are visiting authorities for your asylum interview or for a medical reason. And the disturbing part of it is that asylum seekers are already receiving requests to move to the reception center, and this includes Syrians who are supposed to get protection anytime soon, and Syrian families who have been in Cyprus over 4 years, even reaching 8 and 9 years. Because there's another issue in Cyprus. We have a very long time that we have delays in first instance as well as second instance decisions. So we have Syrians who have been waiting for decisions prior to the current conflict. We have cases that are prior to 2011. And then, of course, we have many subsequent applications, or applications by Syrians who are in the country under other statuses, like working visas and students. So we have people who are quite well integrated. We have families, we have kids who have been in school for many years and are now being asked to move to this reception center, which is considered a success by both the authorities and the Commission. Another issue that we're expecting to see is the issue of vulnerable person. In the past, when we have requested, vulnerable persons have always supposedly been, according to legislation, exempted under certain conditions from residing, or you could request for them not to be sent to the reception center, and yet such requests have never really been successful. And now with the enlargement, we believe this will be a bigger issue. In our cases that we had dealt with, we had LGBT persons, asylum seekers who definitely would have problems in the reception center, and we requested for them not to be sent there, and they preferred to, they preferred to live in destitute situations than actually go there. So as I said, this So let's get past the reception centers. So what happens after persons receive protection? So the majority of Syrians are receiving subsidiary protection, as in most countries. And we only had one recognition, convention refugee in 2013. And the biggest problem is, of course, the difference in the rights enjoyed under this status. Family reunification rights have been taken away with the recent amendments to the legislation. Travel documents are not issued, so then the prospect of traveling further on is a problem. But we have a lot of refugees living in destitution. As Christopher said, people are leaving. People are leaving who are not asylum seekers, people who have protection, and people who have had protection for many years. We have recognized refugees who are trying to leave Cyprus after 10, 12 years because of the lack of durable solutions. Nationality and long-term residence permits are given to very, very, very few. I think we must be one of the few countries that have persons under the status of international protection after 10 years, after 15 years. I even have a client who's been in the country for 19 years. And there's no real reason. It's not like they have a criminal record and they're being excluded from these rights. So this is a big problem. And then there's the limited integration perspective. So how do you ever really integrate if there's never a jury? You're always under a temporary residence permit. And there's no integration policies and there's no integration projects. So again, I'm really happy I spoke back to you, Christopher, because it's it really is linked, and it is an area that is not being dealt with. So here we have the example where people are not choosing to come, and they're trying to bypass it, and they're trying to get somewhere where they will have a decent standard of living, and they will have real access to protection. So, from Cyprus.
And basically, just two quick sentences to add to what Christopher and then Green said, actually. If you read the AIDA report, that will do one thing which is a wonderful, very profound and detailed in-depth analysis of these 15+ countries, member states in the European Union. What was struck out of the analysis made is that the common European asylum system was built in a way that actually served as a deterrent factor for people, because even though the people are able to go through these barbed wires and to cross these dangerous seas and reach the shores of Europe, and even if recognized after a certain period of time, they will be stuck in this periphery of Europe, because all the legislation, the European legislation, was built in a way that they take care about the standards only until the people are recognized. But nothing is done in respect to recognize a common, well, recognition, it's a repetition, but to recognize the recognized individuals and to give them the same rights everywhere in European Union. So whoever is recognized will be stuck into the European Union periphery. And this is a major deterrence factor, because people would be willing to really reestablish their lives. And nothing into the common European asylum system is done on common integration standards. This is the very big gap that exists in the system. So Europe should sooner or later very strongly reconsider this approach, because this approach speaks volumes. If Europe wants to go back to the basics when this union was established 50 or 60 years ago, when it was announced as area of freedom, justice, and security of the person, not of the states. So when you do your reporting about AIDA, please mind this.
Thank you, Iliana, for your frank words at the end. Thank you to all of you for your insights into the particular issues and for raising the access not only to the territory but also to protection issues in particular, which is what the AIDA report is indeed focusing on about. I'm not going to summarize again what I said. If there are any questions to anyone in the panel, please raise your hand. If you could quickly introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Stefan Nielsen. I'm a reporter at EU Observer. I had a question for Mr. Hein. You had mentioned about the Mare Nostrum operating primarily in international waters, and now Frontex will be operating exclusively in territorial waters. Is there any concerns that Frontex Plus will be unable to rescue on par or on level with the operation of the
Any other questions? Maybe we can collect some other questions about, please.
Yeah, Oscar Spoon, Jesuit Refugee Service Europe. Also a question for Christopher Hein regarding Mare Nostrum and the countless refugees coming to Italy. Some people argue that Mare Nostrum is a pull factor. How would you respond to that argument that people come because they know or they have a good chance of being rescued by the Italian Navy?
Any other?
Thank you. I'm interested to know whether all of this make a difference between closed border and well-managed national borders. I'm interested to know this because it was mentioned several times that the Bulgarian border with Turkey is closed and there is no access for people. It was also mentioned that Bulgarian authorities argue that there are mixed migration flows, and I believe that this is the case. The statistics is very clear in this regard, and that's why I would like to know whether in the process of preparing such kind of reports are taken into account the needs as the need to make the right balance between the protection of human rights and this very hard situation of the asylum seekers who are coming to the EU borders, and at the same time the need to protect borders, I mean especially external borders of the EU. As for the capacity, of course, I wouldn't argue that there are a lot of things still to be done, and of course, it seems to me that the main issue in front of Bulgarian authorities is the integration policy to be further developed, because we have a new international, new national strategy, and because for the capacity is done enough, let's say for this stage, I think that the priority should be to work more on the integration measures and their implementation into practice, rather than talk about what is done so far, what are gaps. And now we have our common asylum system, and I think that it hasn't worked so far. So we need some time to do this. Thank you.
Could you please state the name?
My name is Lyudmila Krastanova, and currently I'm working here and at the Bulgarian Permanent Representation to the EU. Sorry for this.
Maybe we can go first to Christopher. Questions about
Yes. So one has to say what's about this Frontex Plus and what is really the meaning and what is the new features, and this is not yet very clear. We expect some more precise decisions to be taken in Luxembourg and October. But from the various pronunciations we got from national governments, from France, Germany, and Spain, is that actually it is not, and also from other Malmström itself, it is not intended to replace Malmström scheme and approach, and is not what the Italian government wanted, let's say, take over responsibility from the European Union, maybe under Frontex coordination, other Frontex operations, but with the active participation of units from other member states. So there will be units from other member states on a quite a low level. There will be 3 ships, 2 airplanes, and 2 smaller boats. Now, this is for the time being the schedule. If no other member states will step in the meantime, working and being active in the territorial waters. And this does not solve the problem. So what we, as Italian NGOs, are advocating for in this moment, if this happens, Italy must maintain the Mare Nostrum operation, because otherwise we will really go back to the situation of before 2013, and because of the phenomenon of arrivals by sea will not stop. It is independent. And this comes to the second question, the pull factor. The pull factor, okay, we can demonstrate that the partial increase of numbers of arrivals started early July 2013, where Mare Nostrum started 17th October 2013. So these 4 months in between were 8 months we had an increase in numbers of arrivals. Due to the same reasons I have mentioned before. What is true, or may be true, that smugglers in Libya are using even less seaworthy boats, because it is a question just to go a moment out of the Libyan territorial waters to be rescued there. So you find really boats you will not even cross, I don't know, the river. Not to speak about the Mediterranean Sea. This is actually also one of the reasons why you have so many losses of life in the Libyan territorial waters, where I repeat, the Italian Navy cannot, of course, operate. Not on the basis of agreement, but disagreements would certainly would not advocate for in this moment with the Libyan situation, where there's no guarantee at all for the people who then are intercepted and brought back to the Libyan territory. So the pull factor, you can demonstrate it is not true that this is the reason for the increase of the arrivals in the numbers, but it is unfortunately true that it had an impact on, let's say, the operational mechanism of transport from the smuggling organizations, in particular those in Libya, partly also those working in Egypt.
So, if I correctly understood, the question was well-managed border versus closed borders, and what is our perception of what is closed border and what is well-managed border. And to be straight open, I would say that we never actually insisted on open borders, fully open borders, so everybody let in, etc., which doesn't mean that which means that we never said that Europe should, open all the external borders and let everybody in. All we insist on is that whatever responsibilities and obligations and actually rights the border guards have to not let in migrants into European territory, there is one big exclusion, and this is asylum seekers. All asylum seekers, disregarding the manner they approach the border or try to get in, they have the right to come in. They have the right to come in, and this is called access to protection. And access to protection cannot happen without access to territory. And this is all we talk about. about the means and resources that are out there to allow these people to make their statement, to identify themselves as asylum seeker, to claim asylum before the border guards, so they can be let in. And when you talk about barbed wire, and when you talk about, you know, people being not allowed to come to the territory of the country, it is a closed border. And there was a statement from the border police and the government repeatedly about all these months when the fence was built. And actually, what the Bulgarian authorities are intending is to channel the people who can asylum, not to this dangerous areas in the mountain where they can be lost in this rugged terrain, but to try to channel this flow of people to the border checkpoints where they can come. So they said whoever comes at the border checkpoint and cleanses out will be let in. But that didn't happen either, because we had numerous cases of registered cases and reports about people who approached Bulgarian border guards, including at the border checkpoints, and claimed asylum, and were still returned. And they are not allowed to enter the territory. The last one is from 2 weeks ago, when having a pregnant woman approached border guards from the border checkpoint, and she was denied to enter. And only after the intervention of the NGOs, she was allowed to let in. Her husband being already an asylum seeker, pending determination in the country. So well-managed borders means that people who are asylum seekers have the opportunity, and that means physical opportunity, to approach the authorities and to make their statement, so this statement can be taken into account. Anything else tantamount to possible. And this is our understanding and approach, and that's what we're talking about.
Just to add, indeed, that also from the academic perspective, of course, it's not so much a matter of open borders or closed borders, it's a matter of protection sensitive border management. And there is states have, it is perfectly legitimate for the states to control the entry to their territory. There's no denying that, but of course this has to be done in compliance with international obligations. One of them is indeed giving the opportunity for people to apply for asylum and exercise the right to asylum as enshrined in Article 18 of the Charter. And I think this issue of where the border meets the asylum seeker is becoming increasingly complex, both for state authorities and for NGOs trying to assist asylum seekers trying to uphold the right to asylum in Europe. But indeed, I think states also have to realize that what's the end objective of stepping up the border controls and having more sophisticated and ever more sophisticated means of trying to prevent entry to the territory, and at the same time have the discourse of if they arrive here and they apply for asylum, they are allowed to the territory. That all makes no sense if people can't make it to the border, of course. Is there any other question, please?
All right, I just have a question for Mr. Hunt. When we talk about territorial waters, what do you mean in terms of nautical miles? And what is when we talk about international waters? What are we talking about here as well? Do we have a statistic or numbers on the area that where these operations are taking place, just to get some sort of relative perspective in air operational zones where Frontex Plus is intended to operate, as opposed to where Mare Nostrum is now.
I know it's another next.
My name is Nasser Ishaq. I was the UNHCR representative in Cyprus for about 4 years, but I'm now working on voluntary basis to Cyprus to stop trafficking. I'm not going to ask specific questions, but make some maybe comments that can help better understand, because I'm happy that Cyprus is now included in this database because it will allow better understanding of the situation. Because when you try to solve the wrong problems, you come to solutions that have the opposite of the wrong results for the beneficiaries. Saying even persons who are already receiving international protection in Cyprus are trying to leave or have left the country. So this is very disturbing, and certainly some issues that need to be analyzed in a better and more objective way. Like the issue of the detention of asylum seekers. The law clearly prohibits the detention of asylum seekers in Cyprus. So therefore, if there is one single asylum seeker in detention, this is against the law. And getting to the real reason, it's abuse of authority and misuse of power, as well as sometimes incompetence or system failure that leads asylum seekers to end up in detention. Therefore, the issue was to confront the abuse of authority by certain persons in high offices, which was done through NGO organization. The issue also of that why, or the question, why Cyprus, which is the closest EU member state to Syria, is receiving so few. Understanding of this question will allow maybe more asylum seekers to arrive in Cyprus. So my point is that we need really to have a clear understanding of the circumstances on the ground to be able to come with strategies, because very often the solutions that are being produced through advocacy, that are wrong advocacy, lead to wrong solutions or results for the persons of concern. And the issue of Syrians, again, 3 million Syrian refugees and similar numbers of internally displaced are not so few. They are large numbers of people that need international protection, and different strategies need to be there to deal with the situation and not simply deal with it as a normal refugee outflow. Like historical background, given now numbers in Italy are much bigger than 1956, then 64, and whatever. So I think there are bigger questions that need to be also answered. And again, I use Cyprus as an example of trying to solve their own problems and come with their own solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
Yes. Thank you, Madam from MBI and Navy University. I first of all like to congratulate ECRE on this very much needed and important contribution to the source of information in this situation. Several speakers have mentioned the importance of ensuring free movement of the right protection, including legal support prospects, and then to integrate to continue having sustainable livelihoods. I'd just like to ask them to do how we might work towards achieving this in a way that encourages states such as those in the position of the area of Cyprus, and to make greater efforts to fulfill their obligations towards people granted protection, ensure that they don't simply seek to have instance of their responsibility to allocate people to move on. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think that a decent answer.
Well, territorial borders, according to the law of the sea, in particular the Montego Bay Convention, is the zone of 12 miles offshore. And then we have the contiguous zone. This is in particular for commercial and fishery reasons, other 24 miles. And then afterwards you have the international borders, but the contiguous zone for the purpose of interception and control of boats, in particular also those boats which no flag, no national flag. Also the contiguous zone is to be counted as international waters. Apart from this, there's sometimes a confusion here, the so-called ZAR zones, the search and rescue zones that are laid down in the Hamburg Convention on ZAR, and there you have in the center of the Mediterranean the third place that you have the Maltese huge ZAR zone, where Malta is supposed to be responsible for rescue operations. They could never and have never fulfilled this obligation. They just to maintain because it has a financial and also officially advantage for them. Actually, many people have died because there was a quarrel between Italy and Malta, who was competent for intervention. Therefore, as I said before, it is so important that the Mare Nostrum operation are established very clearly. There's no debate, even if it is so close to Maltese waters, Maltese territorial waters. So Malta would be La Valletta, would be closes ports, and certainly in European terms also a safe port in the United States, but they never have given back to people in Malta or tried to do so, but always for Italian ports. This all could be questioned if now Frontex comes in. And we are very worried about it, because Frontex, as you know, is first of all not a rescue organization, it's a control organization, it is a border surveillance organization or coordination mechanism for this, and that's what it's about. Even in the light of the recent regulation of Frontex with regard to sea operations and rescue. But you still have the possibility of intercepting and people back to the country where maybe the responsible person at that moment thinks that it's a safe port of the identification. So we are worried about it. What is to be said, of course, of the distinction between territorial waters and international waters, is that in territorial waters it is very clear that you have a national obligation. And you have also a national right to intercept whatever ship in your waters. You have not this right in international waters, except for two reasons given in the Montego Bay Convention. This is where it is piracy or where it is slave trade. Only for these two reasons you can intercept vessels on high sea. So what is done under the Mare Nostrum operation is a little bit also, let's say, to have an answer to what in the international law to see is not clearly answered. The other question on Bengali, how can we promote the movement of persons and scattering of persons in other countries? I think we have really to make a financial cost and benefit calculation. We all know, at least those who are in this room, I suppose, that it is so costly that you have people who have no link at all to an asylum country. And a certain portion of these would be also at risk of being getting out of the society. And that it is extremely costly then to have social rehabilitation, not to say prison. So this is a fact. Where in another country, if you would have the freedom of establishment, there are communities, there are relatives, there are men who could support, not from public funds, but privately, solidarity, private solidarity, those things, support the integration process. In this calculation, not, let's say, to speak only about, let's say, of the well-being of the refugees, but of the well-being of the state finances. This calculation, I think, has still to be done, has still to be demonstrated. Research has to be done more clearly on the cost effectiveness possible and the counterproductive mechanism under the Dublin regulation. We speak very much widely, of course, as a potential agency. We speak about the detrimental effect for the persons, for the asylum seekers and for the refugees, but we should also speak a little bit more about the detrimental effects for the welfare systems and the
I'd just like to add to that under no circumstances are we advocating that the solution is just people moving on. But contrary, what we are saying is that, or what I'm saying is this gap on the day after. So you receive protection and what happens the day after. And just to give you an example, in Cyprus, the authorities could easily push people with international protection down the road by giving them nationality or long-term residence permit, and yet they don't. I don't know any refugee who has received a long-term residence permit, and very, very few have received nationality. And for me, this goes to show the general attitude towards this, and I suspect that the reason that long-term residence is not given is the fear that maybe they don't move on, and then I've given them more rights, and then I've given them a more permanent. But then that's my estimation, because when the law was going to pass, I thought it would be given out to everyone, and this was like, yeah, here it is, and now you can move on, and then it didn't. So why? And I think this goes to show with the Cyprus the general attitude and the general lack of integration prospects and attitudes towards refugees. So no, I would never advocate that people should just move on. I would continue to advocate that the situation and the environment in which the host country is operating definitely has to work on. But obviously there are certain countries where the numbers just really can't work, and obviously there's a balance in the solutions.
So this is really very interesting question, which actually goes back to the heart of the problem. And of course, political arguments have never prevailed. The economic ones, which is really very ironical in situation of economic crisis right now, or at least the end of it, for most of the countries, not all. But the problem is that Dublin itself costs a lot, and all this money could be invested in integration measures. Border control measures, intensified border controls, including building whatever you build to prevent access to people, wherever they be, to the countries, costs almost triples the money that are invested for integration. And one of the suggestions would be for you to establish a political party and to try to get your foot into the European Parliament. In order to change legislation, this is really far-fetched. What we can do actually as NGOs, we have to do what we have ever done. And this is to show the other side of the coin. And not only the costs of it, which is a very valid argument, although not all the time heard, particularly in a situation where right-wing parties see such a raise, such a boost across Europe. But as well to show the human side of it, as we have done, because it comes to lives of people, and these are real people. And as Christopher said, sometimes it's not even about the money and the prospects for you, what you'll be able to achieve in this country and how fast you'll be able to rebuild your life. It's just a matter of after the traumatic experience you have suffered to join the rest of your family, which is elsewhere, not in this first Islamic country. So these are the things that we can do.
Just to conclude, I have nothing much to add to all the arguments that have been raised here in that question. But I think if we should start looking at refugees as equal members of our societies, I think we would already make a good start. And I think also that we need to become much better in showing what refugees contribute to our societies. I think that is a crucial thing. Many of our member organizations have been doing work on that. But I think we can do much more there. I think it's not only a matter of cost and benefit, but also of the benefits that it brings. And free movement, in a way, in this kind of old way with this common European asylum system is being constructed, can be seen as a kind of a solidarity measure as well. And that is something that I fail to understand why some of the countries who actually benefit from free movement are not much more adamant on that issue. But it is certainly a very interesting and challenging question, and we are actually looking at this issue of mutual recognition. We are actually finalizing a paper on that issue in the coming weeks. So more to come from us. If there are no further burning questions, remarks, I would really like to thank the three speakers, Paulina, Christopher, and Iliana. Helene as well, of course. I would like to thank in particular Azam Daboul, who is filming this whole thing, who has actually worked until late this night to get the report ready, together with Sylvia Gavisana. Thank you for that, and hopefully see you soon on another activity. Thank you.
Er is nog een keer gekomen. Ik denk dat hij volgende week terug is. Maar op het werk is hij volgende week pas terug. Maar misschien